In our three readings this morning, the first from the prophet Isaiah, the second from the Psalms, the third from the Gospel of Matthew, we find the same powerful image, the image of the nation and the people of Israel, being described as a vineyard that has been intentionally planted and maintained by a very careful vintner. Now, vineyards are a very interesting kind of farm. Grapes themselves are not particularly hard to grow. In fact, they grow wild in many climates, and the vines spread easily and rather spontaneously. But good grapes, especially grapes that make good wine, well, that's another matter. You have to have just the right strain, the right soil, and even small variations in the microclimate can make or break your batch of wine. So the vintner in the story, in these passages, is very careful, selecting the right wine, the right vine, importing it, in fact, at great personal cost from Egypt. And then he carefully roots out all of the other strains of grapes from his garden so that they do not contaminate his precious vine. And then once he's planted it, he protects it by building walls to keep out foragers and builds a watchtower to guard against bigger threats. All of this is to show how valued this vineyard is by the vintner and how he is looking forward to tasting his wonderful vintage. And I can understand why the people of Israel like to think of themselves as a vineyard like this. It made them feel valued and protected. When Isaiah and the psalmist and Jesus used this image, you can be very sure that the crowd smiled and they thought, yeah, that's a pretty nice way for us to describe ourselves. Now, I would note that it's not an image without some problems. Because you see, it is one thing to cultivate grapes by eliminating all variant strains. But when you do that with a nation and with a people, well, that's called eugenics. And it's often a very short trip from eugenics to things like ethnic cleansing and genocide. According to the book of Joshua, when God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt and transplanted them in the promised land, he did so by driving out the nations in order to plant his vine. And that is described in the book of Joshua in terms of the people of Israel slaughtering whole cities, whole tribes. But of course, they didn't like to dwell on that part of the story, but rather on the sense of security and importance they gained from living inside what felt like a well-built and protected vineyard. And I think that we, as Canadians, can certainly understand this sentiment. It's the same story we've told ourselves for a long time. We are like a vine that God has brought out to live in this beautiful place. And I know we didn't all come from the same place. Some of us, however many generations ago, were transplanted from England or Scotland or Ireland. Many were transplanted from Germany or the Netherlands and places far, far beyond. And yes, that transplanting did involve the displacement of the peoples and nations who were here before us, and a lot of that went very poorly for the displaced people. But of course, we don't like to dwell on that part of the story because we know that we have enjoyed so many blessings in this place. And we have been like that well-protected vineyard with sturdy walls surrounding us, guarding from danger, a high watchtower to watch over us for safety. And we have prospered in this land. And in our prosperity, we have sent out our roots and been able to spread and fill this whole land from sea to another sea in the north. And we are grateful indeed for all of that. And sure, yeah, we like to do a bit of complaining. We complain against this government or that one. We kind of love to complain about the neighbors in the vineyard to the south of us and how they always have to make everything about them. I mean, we wouldn't be human if we didn't complain. But we have felt So blessed, so grateful to live in this wonderful vineyard of Canada. So that's where all three of the readings start, with this well-protected and prosperous vineyard. But, of course, the well-protected and prosperous vineyard is not the actual topic of any of these readings. And in all three passages, we see the wall broken down and strangers coming in to ruin the vineyard. We see the guard tower abandoned and enemies given a free hand. See, all of these passages were written in the aftermath of national catastrophes. Three different catastrophes, because these are things that keep happening again and again throughout history. The passage in Isaiah was written after an Assyrian invasion of the land. The psalm likely was written after the Babylonian destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And the gospel, well, it was written after the Romans had destroyed the nation and the city of Jerusalem. So we have three different disasters that they sought to understand and interpret by using this powerful image of a broken down and wasted vineyard. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we have been given these three readings this morning. You know what? I don't think if we had these readings a year ago, we would have heard them the same way. Because a year ago, we had no reason ever to think that the walls of this vineyard and its protections we thought we had would be broken down. We saw no reason to think that our long-term prosperity in this vineyard would be interrupted. Today, we don't feel like that. And I don't even have to tell you why. We're not feeling as if this vineyard is so safe and prosperous anymore. And the amazing thing is it didn't seem to take all that much to make it feel like that. It took a small thing, a virus so tiny that you'd need a powerful microscope to even see it. That and a few other things, a bit of political chaos, especially in the vineyard to the south of us, a number of political norms fading away. And we are in our own wasted vineyard moment. And I believe that God has sent us these three passages today to help us deal with where we are right now. And I know that some would say that I shouldn't sound all defeatist like this and imagine that these present problems that we're dealing with are permanent. And yes, I agree. I think it's important we remember that there will come a day when a lot of these present troubles will be forgotten, and yet at the same time, I believe we need to understand where we are right now and learn whatever lessons God may have for us in this moment. And yes, there are lessons to be learned. In each of our readings this morning, we see a different lesson. Let's start with the psalm, first of all. The interesting thing about the psalm, as it describes this broken down vineyard, is it doesn't actually call for the people to do anything in response to the disaster. Psalm 80 is what you would call a psalm of lament. And it's basically one long complaint as the people tell God all the ways that they feel disappointed and let down by what has happened to them. Now, this is actually an important and necessary response to a tragedy. When things go wrong, we often don't give ourselves the permission we need to just say how bad things are, to complain, to tell the honest truth about how we're feeling. And I realize, of course, that it sometimes feels very dangerous to let those kinds of emotions out. And yeah, there are times when it's not appropriate, people with whom we really can't do it. But we still need an outlet to those feelings. And one thing this psalm is telling us is that it's okay to do that with God. No matter how you are feeling about these current crises, know that you can take everything to the Lord in prayer. Your anger, your fear, your exasperation. Don't be afraid to tell God. You will be met with abundant grace. So that's our first response, and it's an important one, taking our emotions to God. Our reading from the book of Isaiah gives us another conclusion, and that tells us that God is looking for another response from us. The prophecy from the book of Isaiah concludes like this: "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but he saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry." And this lays before us a very significant challenge. For we have a God who is committed to justice, committed to seeing a society where there is respect for every person, where there is opportunity for every person, no matter who they may be. God is committed to finding justice, especially for the poorest and most marginalized people in society. And as people of faith, we are called, constantly called, to be at work for such justice in the world. I believe that this call to justice is particularly highlighted in this passage in Isaiah, because when we are in times like this, when we are feeling as if our secure and stable vineyard is all broken down, when we are in crisis mode, we often assume that this is not the time for us to work on the bigger issues like social justice, because we're busy concentrating on just surviving. But Isaiah reminds us that this is the time when such efforts are more important than ever. See, there is a phenomenon that comes into play in situations like this. It has been called disaster capitalism. Naomi Klein laid it out in her book, The Shock Doctrine. There are people who see any disaster, any breakdown in society as the perfect opportunity to enrich themselves and to gain power for themselves. And this is absolutely something we have seen in this present crisis, as the richest people in North America have actually seen their wealth grow during this time, even as the people at the lower end of the economic scale have found themselves slipping further and further down. While we're all distracted dealing with this crisis, economic disparity has grown. So it is a time to be thinking about and working towards justice. Everyone needs to be included in a just and economic system. Racial inequalities need to be addressed. A host of other issues need to be tackled. Isaiah is very clear that this is part of the important work we need to be doing precisely when the vineyard is in crisis. So we have one response in the psalm, another in Isaiah, and finally we come to the parable in the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm going to warn you, this is a very difficult parable to understand and interpret. I could probably spend many sermons trying to come to terms with what Jesus was trying to communicate in it. It's a troubling parable. I also happen to think it's a key to understand the approach taken by the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which all include this parable. So I'm not going to try and give a definitive application of this parable to the situation in which we find ourselves. But I'm going to pick out one element that I think definitely applies to this situation where we do find ourselves. The key moment in this parable comes with the appearance of the landowner's son. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. I think it is pretty clear how we are intended to read this part of the parable in the Gospel of Matthew. The Son is intended to be a reference to Jesus himself, the eternal Son sent from the Father above. And the great tragedy of the story is that the people fail to recognize what God has done in sending his Son. Whatever's gone before, whatever justification the tenants may have had in failing to pay their rents, this is when it all crosses the line. This is when they fail to recognize that God has stepped into their story. And I think there is an application of that to the moment where we find ourselves today in this broken vineyard. There's something else we need to do during such a time. We need to keep ourselves open to see what God is doing in this world. We need to believe at such a time that God is alive, that God is at work, maybe in some surprising ways, but God is at work. And when we recognize what God is doing, we need to be ready to get on board. Let us not miss it, like the people in Jesus' parable. This vineyard of ours is in a poor state right now. That's troubling. But we're not the first to find ourselves in such a situation, nor will we be the last. The Bible tells us that when such situations arise, we would do well if we follow the examples we find in the Scriptures. Be open and honest with God about how you are feeling through all of this. Be ready, especially at times like this, to stand up for what is just and right in society. Especially speak up for the outcasts, the people living on the margins. And finally, keep your eyes open for the movement of God in our world. It will happen. And when it does, you want to be part of it. In that last point, I find my greatest hope. Let's pray. Lord our God, these are rough times in many ways, as we feel as if this safe and secure vineyard of ours is broken down and vulnerable, and we're worried and scared often. Thank you that you hear us wherever we are, whatever feelings, emotions we have. You will take them. You will love us no matter what we may be feeling. By your grace, help us to stand up for what is right and just at this time. And keep our eyes open, for you are alive and at work in this world, and we want to be part of what you are doing. Amen.